Welcome to Technical Session 20. Today, or this morning, we're going to be talking about SOHO routers, or Small Office Home Office. SOHO stands for. We're going to be getting into the 802.11 standards, which we will need to know. We're going to be able to compare and contrast connection types and features. For internet service, we're going to be talking about Wi-Fi networking standards and encryption types. Big fun there. We're going to be explaining the role of a router and describe the differences between a wired and wireless router. We're going to be identifying some common pitfalls when installing a SOHO router and common problems that come up with SOHO routers, and then describe how we would go about solving them. And of course, you're going, oh my goodness. Is there a place we can practice some of this stuff? Yes, well, you're in luck. We have Test Out, and they have some labs where we can work through this. But one piece at a time, our BSMs for this particular morning. As we go through this technical session, we're going to be communication. Always a big one in IT, as we have to use different levels of communication depending on who we are communicating with. When communicating with team members, when doing handoffs, we have to be able to, transfer a large amount of information in very clear, concise, and abbreviated language. When speaking to supervisors, we're going to be using completely different tones because they may or may not be IT literate, as managers are typically there to manage resources, not necessarily to be better at the jobs of the people they are managing. And then we have customers, which we would not utilize highly technical language with, for the most part, but be able to convey the meaning and understanding of what it is we're doing and what the problems are. Also, mindset we want to keep in, especially when troubleshooting and working on problems and trying to better our understanding. And especially in this class, persistence. There was an old quote, I think it was attributed to Michael Jordan, I can't remember, but it was something along the lines of work beats talent when talent doesn't work. So if you're talented, but you don't hone your skills or don't practice or don't, try to get better, the ones who are putting in the work day in, day out, trying to get better, are going to pass you. And that comes down a lot to persistence. What is the internet? Other than a place we go to look at pictures of cats and yell at strangers. It is a global system of networks that links billions of computers for communicating, sharing information, and of course, resources. It's made up of millions of private, public, academic, business, and government networks, all linked together by a broad array of electronic, wireless, and optical network technologies. So depending on the areas you're in, you may have older technologies, and others may have far more advanced. When they were first starting to install fiber optics, I think Google did their area in California first, and then the next area they did was in Kansas for some reason. And all of a sudden, the houses in that particular division went from being $100,000 to $200,000 houses to $750,000 to $1 million in very short order, just because of the internet connectivity. Businesses were buying these houses and running their businesses out of them just because of how fast the internet was. It made such a difference. From a physical sense, the internet is essentially a huge TCP/IP based network, which we talked about last week, utilizing a physical mesh topology where almost all nodes are connected to all other nodes. And it makes it very difficult to bring the internet down. And for the most part, the internet is routed through a complex series of routers. Routers know the ones that are connected to them, and they can utilize different pathways to send the packets through the internet. So we're not sending one giant chunk of data that has a high likelihood of getting disrupted, information dropped, and not succeeding. So we break it down into smaller and smaller pieces to make it more manageable and faster. So various connections that we'll kind of get into. We have our wired connections, which gets into our dial-up, ISDN, DSL, cable, and then the all popular fiber optic. And then wireless, we have satellite, cellular, which is now 5G, WiMAX or Wi-Fi, and then tethering, utilizing mobile hotspots, which we have briefly touched on this before as well. So first, getting into our wired communications, we have to start with the old standby that still does exist out there in some parts of the world, especially in rural communities. You have two options, either POTS or satellites. Both have their trade-offs. So POTS, plain old telephone service, dial-up, uses the old school RJ11 jacks, that little squarish one with 4 pins. It's the least expensive of them, and it is hands down the slowest. It's got roughly 56K or 56 kilobytes per second, which is insanely slow compared to modern internet when we're talking about, 1 gigabit Ethernet or 300 megabits, or, generally speaking, if you have less than 30 or 50 in a household, it's going to be hard for you to do much on the internet, let alone do things like gaming or any of that. Why would people use it? When you're traveling, it allows you to have it. Some people utilize it as a backup. Some people use it just because it's inexpensive and or a lack of options. If you're getting into extremely rural communities, this may be the only option you have, this and satellite. And again, there are trade-offs. So not so much anymore, but they, for quite a while there, desktop computer modems had 2 options. You had the standard RJ45 jack, which we use nowadays, and then the older RJ11, depending. Right. It's not the same as DSL that utilizes a different technology over the internet. This quite literally takes over the phone line and is sending audio signals over the phone line, which those of us who are old enough to remember, the loud screaming noise every time somebody was dialing up to the internet. And then an hour plus to download a single image. All right, ISDN, Integrated Service Digital Network. Has the capability to carry voice, video, or data, which was a nice changeover compared to the old POTS line, which you typically had to choose whether you're going to do voice or data. Video, not an option. This one moves through the RJ45 cable, and a modem that is utilized. This is called a terminal adapter, or TA modem. Operates in 2 primary circuits. You have the basic rate interface and the primary rate interface, BRI and PRI. So RJ45 connection, voice, video, or data, and 64 kilobits per second channels, multiples of those. All right, DSL. This one was basically taking the existing phone lines and expanding their usefulness, so to speak. So what they did is they limited the range of our voices over the phone, which if you ever speak over a normal phone line, you notice that your voice, the person you're speaking to doesn't sound quite the same as they normally do. And that's because it's kind of chopping off the highs and the lows. And what it's doing is it's using the highs and the lows to transmit data. So we no longer had to choose whether or not we're going to talk on the phone or transmit data. We could do both at the same time. And they had a few different variants that you could use. And we still kind of use these methodologies today. And what they have is called ADSL or SDSL, and that is asynchronous or synchronous. Sounds almost similar to what we do here, right? So you can use the same phone line for voice data, both at the same time. Asynchronous. Let's see here. I'm going to make sure I got that right. Yeah. So synchronous means your upstream and downstream are the same. So if you have 50 megs going up, 50 megs coming down. So if you had 100 meg bandwidth, you'd have 50 up, 50 down. This is not the way normal consumers utilize the internet, right? How much are you upstreaming? Typically not much. The vast majority of people are bringing information down to them. So they need what's called asynchronous, which is going to give you a lopsided bandwidth. It's typically 80% is coming downstream, 20% upstream. So typically you're streaming things, you're going on the internet, you're looking at stuff and all that. You're not typically uploading video a lot and stuff like that. If you are, you're going to opt for more of a synchronous style. That way you have good upstream bandwidth as well as downstream. And when you are buying internet from a provider, if they say you have like 100 megs per second, that's both of those combined, which is why you'll never really fully achieve 100 megs if you have 100 megs per second. So DSL uses existing phone lines. This is your typical backup line for people who have to have internet up at all times. They'll usually use DSL as a backup. If DSL is not available, then they'll fall back to POTS. All right, cable internet, probably the most common one used today. In theory, it's always connected, always up. Uses existing coaxial cable lines. TV signals, PC data, all that stuff share the exact same line, which is awesome. And it converts all this information from PC digital signals into an analog signal that's sent over the data line. Finally, fiber optic. Downfall of this one is there is no line sharing. We could use multi-mode, but what was the difference between multi-mode and single mode?
The distance traveled.
Distance it can travel, right? So, there is multi-mode, but it still has to get into a medium where it can convert that stuff to multi-mode, and then when it converts to multi-mode, it can't go very far. So it is a short haul. Nice thing about this is that it's extremely high speed. It can do television, internet, data, voice, communication, all that stuff. It is essentially where the infrastructure is going with regards to data transmission. But currently, unfortunately, very expensive for the infrastructure to be installed. The nice thing about cable internet, cable lines are already in place. The infrastructure was already there, already in existence. All we had to do was just use it a different way. And we've kind of, under our understanding of it currently, maxed out that technology. So fiber optic is kind of the way. Next, wireless. One of the big ones that people always think of when we talk about wireless, satellite. and now more recently Starlink. Satellite is really, really good downstream, meaning you being able to download information from a another source. So if you're using it for watching TV, streaming video, things like that, it works wonderfully. You're able to receive the information up to and possibly exceeding around 125 megabits per second. Pretty darn good. Problem comes in when you need to move something upstream. So something like what we're doing right now is kind of difficult to do upstream when you only have 3 megs per second. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is there's heavy latency as well. You have a 2 to 3 second delay, as we talked about earlier, with like the weather people when they're communicating with the anchors in the studio or what have you. It seems like forever when the anchor asks a question to the person on the ground, and it takes like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 seconds, and then they finally start to respond. And all that has to do with the latency of the satellite, because it has to go all the way up to the satellite, down to the person, and then from the person back all the way up, and then back to the studio, which creates a lot of latency. Other big problem, weather conditions. Satellite is a line of sight technology. It has to have a clear view. So if you have things like heavy cloud cover, trees, anything that would block your view of the sky, it's going to make it less and less effective of a technology. All right, cellular. This has evolved quite a bit over time. And the G's you see on the end have nothing to do with the actual speed. It actually stands for generation. And we're talking about generation. We're looking at specific technologies to be in place for it to be considered first, second, third, fourth, and fifth generation. First generation used analog data. We built our infrastructure on this. The US was like, we're going all in on analog. It's the best technology. It's the longest distance. We can do the most with it. Rest of the world went digital. So we were left either being on a technology that does not interact with anybody else on the globe, or switch over. And then all of a sudden we're 5 years behind. So technologies that we were just now receiving, like, pay capabilities and all that stuff with our phone, was being utilized in Europe and Asia and many other places 10, 15 years ago, easy. So we had to switch over to digital. We get into 2G and then finally 3G. We started bringing in the GPRS, edge technology, and then finally the 4G LTE, which LTE just stands for long-term evolution. And this is where the cell technology really started exploding throughout the average person. Prior to this, it was still kind of a novelty thing or a status symbol or any of that kind of stuff. But when 4G finally hit, this is when the average person started actually utilizing cell phones, and cell phones started replacing things like home phones and a multitude of other devices. And it got up to roughly 300 megabits per second towards the end, and then roughly about 75 megabits per second uploading, which is pretty darn good and beats satellites, satellite service hands down. And then now we're finally evolving into 5G technology, which in theory has the capability of 10 gigabits per second download with extremely low latency. The possibilities of this technology are staggering. We're not fully utilizing it yet. We have to basically completely revamp our entire infrastructure to make it work, but it could basically convert us into almost a truly wireless society with it. Now, revisiting our various networks. This is a great one to take a screenshot because it kind of just lets you get an idea with regards to size. Remember our PANs, which is our personal area networks within arm's reach. It's Bluetooth technology for the most part. And that's usually 10 meters or less. This could be headsets, keyboards, mice, microphones, a computer to another, a cell phone to a computer. A PAN, personal area network. And then we get to the LANs, local area networks. This can be wired or wireless as well. And the wireless version of this is the IEEE 802.11. Yes, Andrew.
Just wondering what MTS means.
MTS? Meters, or meters. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
No problem. So LAN gets into the 802.11 or Wi-Fi standards. This is what we're going to be talking about with regards to standards we're going to have to know for the A+. And it's the 802.16, which is the WiMAX, which is more of a metro area network. Some larger cities have this. I believe Philadelphia has it. I'm not sure if New York does. I believe Savannah does. So some cities have these established where they'll have a low throughput Wi-Fi established for the city that the average person could use. And then you have your WAN, which is the wide area network, and the wire standard is the 802.11.20 or 802.20, excuse me, not 11. So used to saying it. And that's when we get above the 150 kilometers. And then the metros, less than 50 kilometers. LAN, about 150 meters. Questions on this? All right, other ones, tethering. So tethering essentially uses your phone as an internet source for, say, your laptop or your car or what have you. This is, they unfortunately tend to blur the line with regards to tethering and hotspot. I tend to think of tethering with regards to using an actual cable. So you would actually take a cable and plug it into your computer and your phone, and they would share the connection that way. And then hotspotting would be turning on your Wi-Fi hotspot on your phone and using it in that manner, or using a hotspot device. And this kind of allows your phone to work as a portable router. Unfortunately, security on this is very low, and you need to be pretty cognizant when you're using it, making sure if you're only connecting one device or two devices, double check and make sure that's all you have connected, because at best, you're losing bandwidth. At worst, you could be inviting some unsavory people into your data. So, something to think about. All right, IEEE standards. This is the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. And we're saying various standards like 802.2, .3, .5, all that kind of fun stuff. Basically, what this is it's a notebook full of things that these share in common. So basically, it's just a list of standards. It's not a frequency or any of that stuff. There are over 100 of these. But for the A+, you really need only be concerned with one of them. And that's the 802.11. When you get into network and security and stuff like that, you'll need to know some more. But for the A+, just the one. All right. So LAN standards. Now, from a wire perspective, it's probably one of the most popular networking standards, what we use and buildings and all that kind of fun stuff. It's very high speed and economical at this point. Logically, operates kind of like a bus. Physically, it can be a star, a ring, or a hybrid. And typically we will use the star, which is the most common, and connect multiple stars with a bus structure. And it could be wired or wireless, utilizing typically copper wire or Wi-Fi for the wireless. And if you've been in large buildings like hospitals or schools or things like that, and you see all the little domes sticking down from the ceiling, you know, the Wi-Fi antennas, they set those up as a mesh LAN. All right. Various types that we will come across. Do we need to know these? You should at least have a pretty good idea. And that is your 10 base T. Remember, the number in the beginning is the speed at which it's transmitting. Base is short for baseband. And the letter or number at the end is your technology that it's using. So 10 base T was probably like old phone line. Then you have 2 and 5, which is thin net, and thick net, which is coax. Then you have 100 base T, which is fast Ethernet. This is when you're starting to get into the RJ45 UTPs. Gigabit Ethernet when you get to the 1000 base, so on and so on. And then our wireless Ethernet is the 802.11, and then the various ones we need to know: A, B, G, N, AC, and now AX, which we're going to talk about each of these in detail. All right. So wiring wireless connections, we've gone through a lot of these already. We know our various copper cable ones, our F-type, B and C, RJ11 and RJ45. We got our fiber optics, which is going to be our single mode fiber, where we have our ST, SC, LC, MTRJ, and multi-mode fiber as well. Single mode utilizes a laser, multi-mode utilizes LEDs, things like that. And then we get into wireless. We have Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and infrared. Infrared is becoming a legacy technology, which is going away, but we still need to be aware of it. Because of slow data speeds and limited range, it no longer really makes sense. So it's typically being replaced in most cases with Bluetooth. Bluetooth has a longer range. It's not obstructed by walls, things like that. So it's generally a better technology. But there still are very, very limited uses with regards to infrared. All right. Excuse me. Wi-Fi characteristics. As we are probably all aware, it utilizes radio waves to communicate. And it's utilizing, as we know now, 802.11 Ethernet standard, and it's marketed as Wi-Fi, not Wi-Fi, even though it's hard to spell. This has, over the last 20 years, this has been the fastest rise in technology because it just grants us so many capabilities. Mobility, the ability to hook up a ton of different devices at one time. And even that has improved, where first it was just, a handful of devices could communicate at a time, to now with Wi-Fi 6, we can have 100 devices on a single Wi-Fi. Granted, we all have to share the same bandwidth, but the communication can still exist. And as bandwidths are improving, it's becoming better and better. And as a network technician, we're going to have to know how to troubleshoot a lot of this stuff and be able to generally set it up and work with it. but we're going to kind of get into that as we go. Picture at the bottom look familiar, Coursera. Fun lab with overlapping channels, all that kind of fun stuff. For the most part, Wi-Fi comes in 2 frequencies, now 3. You have the 2.4 gigahertz bandwidth, and you have the 5 gigahertz bandwidth, and then more recently they've added 6. 2.4 gigahertz has 14 channels that you can utilize. Unfortunately, as we can kind of see in the picture here, they overlap a lot, which can cause crosstalk, interference, bad data flows. So, in order to create non-overlapping channels, there are 3 options. Coursera didn't really express this very well, but this is what it's typically like when you're out in the wild. There are 3 general channels that routers will operate on. And with these 3, you can create a 3-dimensional 2-floor or 3, a floor above you, floor below you, and you can create 3-dimensional maps where you never have overlapping channels. So when you create a mesh, those mesh cannot be on the same channel. So like if you have one on channel 1, the one next to it is likely going to be on channel 6 or 11 because they can't overlap. Otherwise you start having crosstalk problems occur. So 1, 6, and 11, write this down, highlight it, put stars next to it, put it under your pillow, whatever you got to do. You need to know this. 2.4 gigahertz, the 3 non-overlapping channels, 1, 6, and 11. I know, yeah, Coursera made you overlap. As I was saying, Coursera didn't do a really good job of kind of expressing this. So any channels you pick when you're setting up a Wi-Fi device is likely going to be one of these 3. If you want to be a jerk to your neighbors, set it for 3 or 8, because then you'll overlap 2 channels and it negates their ability to use them. Had that happen to Diego, I think his next door neighbor was using channel 8, and so it was affecting his ability to use his router on the 1st floor and the 2nd floor of his house. So So 1, 6, 11. Those are your non-overlapping channels for 2.4 gigahertz. 5, you have a lot more options, but we'll kind of get into that as we go. Wireless standards, 802.11. Remember we were talking about the lists that I made, during my time as a student. One of them was RAID that I wrote down daily until I became comfortable with it. The other one was port numbers that we learned last week, Thursday. The TCP/IP port numbers. The third one that I wrote down on a regular basis was my 802.11 standards. So first up, we have 802.11a. This operated on the 5 gigahertz bandwidth. You do need to know the gigahertz bandwidth it operates on and its throughput, and then a few other little extra details. So it started out at 54 megabits per second, 5 gigahertz bandwidth. 802.11b operated on the 2.4 gigahertz bandwidth and only 11 megabits per second. And you might be sitting there thinking, why on earth did it go down? So we had A, which was the first standard, operating up here, and then we get what, 20% of it goes down to 11 megabits per second. Well, these standards are based upon when they're submitted, not when they go to market. So these 2 standards, A and B, were submitted closely around the same time. B makes it to market first. B was hands down the more popular because first to market. It's not to say that there weren't many devices out there with A. B was just more widely adopted. So only 11 megabits per second, 2.4 gigahertz bandwidth. a little bit of a step down. G comes out, was as high as 54 megabits per second, so they finally catch up to the A standard. 802.11g operates on 2.4 gigahertz, and it was backwards compatible with B devices. Kind of nice, right? You didn't have to get rid of your old stuff. You could bring in the new stuff. Everything works better, right? Caveat. If you have an 802.11 network, or an 802.11g network, excuse me, and you introduce a B device to that network, the entire network's got to slow down to the B speed. Because you can't have one device talking really fast and the other device talking really slow. So everything has to slow down to accommodate the B device. So when the adoption of G was happening, and a lot of angry people sitting there saying, you said this could go up to 54 megabits per second. It's not any faster than the one I had before because of all the B devices that were still being utilized. They didn't update the technology. So while it's capable, doesn't necessarily mean it's optimal. But we do have to remember G backwards compatible with B. Questions so far? Okay. All right, 802.11n. This one was great. 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. So it could work both simultaneously, and it's backwards compatible, all in one package. Awesome. Also achieved much better throughput with its multiple input, multiple output, or MIMO. Yes, we need to know this. So 802.11 introduces MIMO technology, multiple input, multiple output. These are recognizable by the Wi-Fi routers that look like an upside down spider. See the multiple antennas sticking off the top of them. This also allowed what is called channel bonding. So in the 5 gigahertz bandwidth, it could utilize multiple channels simultaneously to improve throughput. So instead of having to rely upon a single channel, it could use multiple at one time. And the nice thing was we jumped up from the 54 megabits to 130 to 150 megabits per second, which is really nice for Wi-Fi at this time. So backwards compatible, uses 2.4 and 5, implementation of MIMO. That just wasn't good enough for us. We needed more. So we moved into 802.11 AC, which operates solely on the 5 gigahertz bandwidth. And it could use wider channels in this range and could bond up to 8 channels at one time, which is awesome. So it improved your throughput significantly. And it used an upgraded version of MIMO, which is called multiple user, multiple input, multiple output, or MUMIMO. Yes, it's a thing. So MUMIMO gave us speeds up to 1 gigabit per second. Questions on this? All right, get my pen handy here.
Yeah, Kelly.
Yo.
When it comes down to the 2.4 gigahertz band and 5 gigahertz band, what is the what is the major difference and like benefits of those?
You have a lot more channels within the 5. 2.4 is better at traveling through walls, and can go a longer distance. 5 has a higher throughput at a shorter range, but it's also easier to be obstructed by walls and things like that. So that's the general one. You have more channel options with 5 over 2.4. 2.4 has the possibility of being interfered with a variety of radio things, because 2.4 is one of the more common radio signals for non-Wi-Fi things, like fun things like microwaves, wireless phones in your house, things like that tend to all operate off of that 2.4 gigahertz bandwidth. So 5 is a cleaner signal, but again, doesn't travel as far, and it gets absorbed by barriers much easier.
I'm sorry, you said 2.4 can be interfered by radio signals?
Yeah, the radio signals, like, a lot of walkie-talkies operate at 2.4, but most commonly it's microwaves and wireless phones also operate on the 2.4, so they interfere with Wi-Fi a lot. So if your router's on 2.4 and your kitchen is between your router and your office, somebody turns on the microwave, you're gonna have problems. All right. 802.11a6 or AX, excuse me, operates on 3 different channels: 2.4, 5, and 6. Nice, right? This gives us a lot of flexibility in Wi-Fi dense environments. Places like apartment buildings, office buildings, things like that. We're going to have a lot of Wi-Fi routers in a very, small area. These work very well in those types of environments. These are extremely high efficiency, low latency transmissions. So this is probably one of the first Wi-Fi routers that gaming actually becomes a possibility. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the best, but it starts to become a real possibility with regards to this. Let's see here. I'm trying to find the so instead of the MUMIMO, it has, where is it called here? It's orthogonal frequency division, multiple access. So OFDMA. And I'm trying to get a quick speed on it. I think it's 10 gigabits, but I got to make sure. Ten gigabits per second. There you go. So that's the rough theoretical speed you could achieve with 802.11ax. So operates on 2.4, 5, and 6. This is called Wi-Fi 6. Uses the OFDMA and 10 gigabits per second throughput. Questions?
The D in that was division, right? For OFDMA.
The what?
In OFDMA, was the
What about?
D division?
I
Yes,
think it was orthogonal. It was either division or direction. I'm trying to remember.
it's division.
Yeah,
All right.
orthogonal frequency division. There we go.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. Some other wireless models we need to be aware of. One's called ad hoc mode. And this is kind of a peer-to-peer wireless connection that can be made between two computers. These work for small groups to transfer files, share printers, stuff like that. It's usually a Bluetooth connection. The danger with this is if you leave it on. You turn this on, you use it for what you need to use it for, and then you turn it off. Here's the danger. If somebody senses that connection or is able to pick up on that connection and then connect to your system, they will be able to essentially use all your security and access to get through. So if you're signed into work, they'll be able to, through your connection, access all the stuff you have access to. So these are good for short bursts of communication or doing specific things, but once you are done with them, they need to be turned off because they are a major security risk. And that is ad hoc mode, creates a small Wi-Fi peer-to-peer network between systems. Infrastructure mode on WAPs, or wireless access points. We talked about this when we got into the wireless mesh network. It uses one or more WAP together, and you have, a singular controlling device that will push out information to all the other devices. So they all operate as the same thing, or the same piece. They'll all have the same sign-in and password, and operate as a mesh. So as you're losing signal with one, you gain onto the others. And that is an infrastructure node on wireless access points, or WAPs. All right, let's get into some encryption. So not too long after we started transmitting data over wireless, did we start to realize that other people could intercept those signals and look and see exactly what it is we're transmitting. So security quickly became an issue. So one of the first encryptions they came up with was WEP, or Wired Equivalent Privacy. This is your lowest form of encryption. It's 40 or 100 bits static key. So the two units that are going to be communicating need to have an identical key. It is extremely easy to compromise. Hackers who know what they're doing can bypass this in about 2 to 3 minutes. And it's primarily through the use of the static key. It makes it very easy to break the encryption on it. So we had to get a little bit better. So we moved up to what is called Wi-Fi Protected Access, or WPA. This uses what's called a dynamic encryption key generation, where the key is essentially changing with each packet that is being sent. And it uses a technology called TKIP, or Temporal Key Integrated Protocol. to create an enhanced version of encryption over the previous web. And what happens here is you have what is called a key exchange. So each computer will have what's called a public and a private key. And the public key is something that you would, being public, it would be what you would share. So if I wanted to have an encrypted communication between myself and Rachel, I would give her my public key and she would give me her public key. And whatever information I send, it's almost like putting it in a box with two locks. One key can only lock the box. So the public key encrypts it, but it can't decrypt it. So I put the information in a box, I lock it with my key, I send it to Rachel, and her private key, since I have her public key, is what unlocks it. And then when she responds to me, she puts the information in the box, the encrypted box, and she uses my public key that I gave her to lock that box, and she sends it to me, and then I use my private key to unlock it or decrypt it. So this is called a key exchange. Does this make sense? So it's a little bit more complicated than just having a static key. Like you need to have, the secret number to be able to unlock the encryption because somebody else can figure it out. And each packet that is being sent, this key is going to change a little bit. So it's going to be harder and harder for them to be able to figure it out. Now, is it bypassable? Yes, especially now. This technology has, been figured out to a degree. So we had to up it again. And they improved upon the key exchange. Now we have what's called a pre-shared key. We use the Advanced Encryption Standard, or AES. And yes, you need to associate AES with WPA2, just like you need to associate TKIP with WPA. This now uses a 128-bit block cipher, which is far tougher to crack than the original WPA. And I believe we're up to WPA3 right now, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, we are now up to WPA3. And this is the most secure protocol that is available nowadays. So WPA2 has now been bypassed, the AES has been improved, and we're now into WPA3, which is the most up-to-date one. Now, faced with it on the test, if they only give the options of WEP, WPA2, and WPA, obviously you would opt for WPA2. Why would you use a encryption standard lower? Like, why do they give you the option of the 3 on your router? The devices you're using may not be able to handle the encryption level of WPA or WPA2. So if the device you're using is unable to handle that level of encryption, then you have to use the level at which it can. Now, WPA or WEP, is it weak? Yes, but it's also better than nothing, right? So we do want to bear that in mind. Questions so far? All right. So here's kind of a review of 802.11 standards. We have another slide that kind of sums it up a little bit as well, but this is a good one to kind of take a screenshot of for studying. The big things you want to pay attention to: number, throughput. You don't necessarily need to know range. That's more of a network plus thing, but you do need to know the frequency. And they don't have it on here, but MIMO and MUMIMO you need to know. as well. All right. Why don't we pause right here? Been going for quite a while. All right, so we've talked about different types of internet connections. We've gotten into our 802.11 categories, and then we started getting into various levels of encryption that we can use to kind of protect our data as we're transmitting. Now we're going to take a little bit of time here and talk about routers themselves. So there's a couple different kinds of routers you can come across. The one many of us are most familiar with is the one that we use in our homes. And I'm sure it doesn't look like this. This is a relatively old one. But you may have one, it looks like the upside down spider that we talked about, has 8 to 10, little antennas sticking up out of it. It may be the square, cylindrical box in the back. And we tend to refer to these as routers, even though they are multifunction devices. They tend to serve a lot of purposes, not just being a router. And then we have the more enterprise version, which look like this. And this is what you would typically see at mid to large companies. This would be something that you put in your server rack. And then you would connect it to your switches and what have you to be able to establish internet for the rest of the office or whatnot. So what do they typically do? They control the flow of data. They tend to try to get our information to its overall destination through utilizing a connected network of routers, not just inside of our networks, but out in the internet as well. It routes this information based upon IP addresses, which will tell the router a bunch of information based upon what it sees. It knows, what network it's supposed to go to. From our perspective, as we looked at the network subnet mask, we knew that, or we can kind of associate extremely large networks with very large metro areas, what have you. So those are going to be a little bit easier to identify than, say, Perry, Florida, which not many people would know where that is. So based upon the information it has, it's able to forward that and forward those packets on and utilize the quickest means possible to get it where it needs to go. It also allows us to share singular connections where we can have a multitude of computers hooked up to a single router sharing a single IP, which is pretty nice and allows for more efficient use of addressing. And they have both wired and wireless versions available. Most do both, with the exception of the enterprise ones. Those tend to be single use. Now, other ways that we can utilize our routers, especially on an enterprise level, typically this is seen in enterprise, you won't usually see these in homes for the most part, are WAPs, or wireless access point. And this is kind of a bridge to swap between a wireless to a wired connection. And we've talked about these kind of extensively. And they can act as, kind of like a switch with regards to all the other wireless devices trying to communicate either through the internet or with each other. But again, typically enterprise settings. Now, the fun thing about these WAPs is installing them. Do we really want to run power to every single one of these? It's more stuff that's got to get done. You got the, standards that have to be maintained for it, all that fun stuff. Maybe you have to bring in an electrician to do it. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it's a lot more work. So somebody figured out, since we can push power over copper wires, not just data, we can actually power these devices through the Ethernet cables that we use. So they developed technology called PoE, which is power over Ethernet. And that allows these wireless access points that you see in the roofs of a lot of buildings to actually receive the power it needs to, function through the Ethernet cable. So we don't even have to run a power cord to each of these. It now receives all the power it needs from the cable. And we have to utilize the device to push that power over the line, which is called a PoE injector. So this will push the 110 current over the Ethernet line, allowing you to power your devices. Kind of neat, huh? Figured out a way to, make installations less complicated, be able to put devices in more less convenient areas to run power, all that kind of fun stuff, and still be able to have the devices functioning. But there's also an inversion to this. So we're able to run power over our data lines. Why not run data over our power lines? So we have the inversion of this, which is EOP, which is Ethernet over power. And if you live in a home that has copper power lines, you can actually run Ethernet through the power lines that already exist, from one plug in a wall to another plug in a wall. And this gives you near hardline speeds over the outlets. So where my office is located in my house is on the complete opposite side of the house of where the Wi-Fi router is. So utilizing Wi-Fi is very, very difficult. I also haven't had the opportunity to run wire yet, even though I've got it set up. So what I did was I utilized a EOP unit, and it hooks up right behind my router. I plug in an Ethernet cable, and then it pushes the data right through the power lines pre-existing in my home to where my office is. And I get extremely high-speed internet without having to rely upon Wi-Fi, and I didn't have to run wires. So for people who live in apartments, if you have cinder block homes, things like that, where it's difficult or there's not a way to kind of do it cleanly. I know people who've run them up through the HVAC, the air conditioning vents and stuff like that, but that usually doesn't look good. So this serves as another viable alternative. So you have power over Ethernet, where you run power over our data lines, and we have Ethernet over power, where you run data over our power lines. And typically, as long as it's on a singular breaker, it works pretty well. One second. All right, questions on this? Power over Ethernet or Ethernet over power?
Yeah, I was interested in knowing how is it that they configure the line, not configure the line, configure what is being pulled or pushed, like whether, okay, I'm using this cable to push power or pull power, or push data or pull data. Like, how do they configure that?
Well, it's the devices on either end that are basically going to have to unscramble that information. But in the case of Ethernet over power, it's pushing them both over the exact same line. So I'm not overly familiar with the engineering involved, but they're able to send the data, like one injects the data into the line, and then the other on the other end is able to unscramble it so that it can be read. There's certain things that'll interfere with it. Like if you have speakers, like if you have built-in surround sound, in your house, the magnets from the speakers will actually interfere with the Ethernet over power. So there are still things that can interfere with it. But typically it works pretty well unless you have to go through a breaker, a primary breaker. So if you have to go through a primary breaker box, it doesn't work anymore. So if you have a house that's big enough to have multiple breakers, it will only be able to work on the same breaker it's on. If that makes sense. I don't know, does that answer your question, Andrew?
Yeah, it makes sense. And thank you.
Yeah. So those ones, the early versions of them weren't that great, but now the technology on them is getting really good. So, all right. So that's WAP, EOP, or PoE. All right. SOHO router. Again, SOHO stands for small office, home office. And these routers tend to perform multiple functions as opposed to just being a router, which is why people tend to have a misunderstanding as to what exactly a router does, because their interactions with it are what we use in our homes, which is, again, a multifunction device. It serves all the functions of a router, a switch, a gateway, a bridge, a DHCP server, a wireless access point, you know, all of this, and it has some firewall functionalities, all within a single device. You don't typically see this on a enterprise level. You have individual devices that will handle these functions. And though they work pretty good, the standalone hardware is going to be more robust and be able to handle a lot larger throughput. But for small home offices, small homes, or small home offices or home offices, these work great. It's a low-cost option. Comes with a lot of the stuff built in. We don't necessarily have to worry about it. So it works out pretty good. Now, installing them, for the most part, they're plug and play. Pretty good. You plug them in. Most of the basic settings are done for you. Your ISP will generally have a rep come by and set it up for you. But there's a lot of additional features in them that we can go in and manipulate. Has anybody here ever logged into their router? Kind of work on it a little bit. It's generally not the app on your phone. Like if you have Xfinity and they have the Xfinity app, that's not really logging into your router. You know, but we can establish our encryption. We can set up port forwarding, port triggering. There's a lot of really cool stuff we can do just with the routers that we get from our ISPs. You can set up basic firewalls, quality of service, all that.
Don't they have password
Yes, they do.
blockage? So how would you be able to get into it?
Most of them are established with a basic admin password. In fact, today I will be sending you guys 2 links. One link will tell you the basic sign-in and password for every router that's on the market, which should give you an indicator. If you have not changed this, that means anybody who comes within the range of your network can. And then they can own your network. The other is a simulator of all the various different types of routers where you can go in and turn on whatever router you want. And then you can sit there and go in and play with the features and all that stuff without messing up your router. So I'll be giving you all both of those links today. So your homework for tonight is to go into your router. If you've never been into your router, 1, figure out how to get into your router, go into it, sign in, and change your administrative sign-in and password so that your networks aren't wide open. So that's going to be your homework for tonight. Now, how do we get into our routers? What is the information we receive when we run the ipconfig command?
IP configure.
Yeah, what do we get when we put that in?
It tells you like the IP address that you have, and I think like subnet mask too. Also,
That's 2 pieces. What else does it give us?
does it give you the protocol like IPv4 or 6?
Typically, but when you get your IP address, you'll know. If it's got letters in it, it's 6, right?
Gateway.
DNS, gateway. It's the 4 pieces of information we always need. IP address, subnet mask, gateway, and DNS server. All those are needed to communicate with the internet, right? So what do we think the router is in our house?
The gateway.
Gateway. How would we communicate with our gateway?
Using the
From MAC
IP
address.
config.
Well, not using the IP config. The IP config gives us the IP address. How do we?
A MAC address.
Not the MAC address. So if I wanted to say connect with my router, what would I need to do? I have its IP address now. So what can I do with that?
Do I put the IP on the network adapter?
I have to put it on the network adapter. I can just open up a web address here and say my IP or my router is 10.0.0.1. So once I put in that IP address for my gateway, I should get a screen that looks like this.
So you log into the gateway and then try to
Then you would
manipulate
need-
it.
Well, then you would have your username and password, which you should be able to get based upon the type of router you have. So I know mine's an Xfinity, right? And Xfinity tends to reuse the same kind of password over and over and over and over and over again. And then I could go to that website I'm going to give you, and you type in whatever the generic username is, which is something like admin or administrator. And then the password is probably just password to start with. And then you log in there, and then you can go and you can change your admin sign-in and password. So that is going to be your homework for tonight. If you have never done this, log into your router, change its username and password. At least give yourself the most basic level of security. Right?
And please remember what you changed it to.
Yeah. Otherwise, you have to reset the whole router and all that fun stuff. So, but this is where we would go in, make all of our settings and changes and all that kind of fun stuff. If we want to set up a DMZ and put all of our Internet of Things stuff on the outside of that DMZ so that it's not internally on our network, you know, like your Ring doorbells and all that kind of fun stuff, we can do that. Because typically the rings and all that stuff don't need to communicate internally with us. They need to communicate externally with their server, right? And if we want to see what's on our Ring, you know, whatever, if we have one of those, I don't know why people do, but people do. If we want to communicate with it, we have to go to the Ring website or application to be able to see what's on our security cameras on our house, right? So that would be something maybe we'd put in the DMZ. It's not that there's necessarily anything wrong with Ring there, Andrew, but anything that's regard to security or security cameras or any of that kind of fun stuff, why would you set it up so that all the video is going to somebody else? Right? You would want your internal cameras to come to you. So that's my issue. Well, the thing is large companies get hacked all the time. And so if all of that information is flowing to a large company, they get, you know, bypassed or whatever, then all of that stuff is now openly available. So if I was going to set up cameras in my house and all that stuff, I would buy basically cameras that I can set up internally and run through my own internal servers. And then I could store them in a cloud service if I wish. But again, I want it to be something that I'm in control of, not somebody else is in control of it. Much the same reason why I don't like Alexas and stuff like that as well. I have an Alexa device that was given to me as a gift. It's plugged in 1 day a year. The rest of the time it's in a box in a closet. All right. Yes, that still does happen. It's not back then, Jose, that is today. That is happening still to this day. All right. So step to installing a SOHO router. Try to find a centralized location in your house or office, however. Make sure it is close to an AC or a power source that you can plug it in. Connect your network cables if needed. Most of us don't. It just goes straight to Wi-Fi. But if you want to plug it into a wired network, if you have one, you would be able to hook it in at this point. And then you would start up a PC, connecting to that router using your browser per the manufacturer's instructions, which is pretty much what we just did. Open up a browser. Once you type in your IP config, you know your router's IP address, and then you can go connect to it and then log in and all that fun stuff. Then you can configure all the settings however you wish, set up your WPA, WPA2, WEP, or what have you, whichever level of encryption you wish. Have all it set up. You can update your firmware settings if they have it. And please, oh please, if you have WPS on your router, turn it off. But we'll talk about that here in a minute.
Can you go back real quick?
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm good.
All right. Okay, SSID, short for Service Set Identifier. This is the name of our network. When we go on our phone and we look for Wi-Fi networks, we see all those funny names pop up. That is our SSID. When we're in our router, a lot of times we can configure this. Some ISPs make it so you configure this in an application or an app, where you would have some of the settings that you would set up on your router on the app, and some of the settings would be in the router itself. So depending on your provider, would determine which of these you would need to use. And so you can name your network whatever you want to name it. You know, if you want to name it FBI van on the corner, that's always a funny one. You can set it up, establish it, whatever you want to be. You know, just something that you know what it is. Just try to make it so it's not the same as somebody else's. But, you know, the old school ones, people would just plug them in and start using them. And unfortunately, the generic names they come with are also on the list. So people driving by could see you have Linksys 2152, and they knew exactly what make and model router you had, what the generic sign-in and passwords were, and what the generic admin sign-in and passwords were. So they could pull right up to your house and basically take over your internet. That's funny, just. All right, so channels. Again, if you're using 2.4, you can use channels 1 through 11, although us being savvy, you know, IT professionals now know we use 1, 6, or 11. So those are the non-overlapping channels. And you can change this channel and set it up on your router, and you know, establish it however you wish. Some people just allow the router to detect it automatically, and most of the time this works just fine. But if you wish, you can go in and change it if you want. And then you know, because sometimes if somebody new comes in and it's on one channel, they manually set theirs and it interferes with yours. You have to go in and manually change it. So inside the router is where we would do this. MAC filtering. We've mentioned this briefly before when we were talking about MAC addresses. We're going to mention it again. For the purposes of the A+, they consider this a security protocol. In real life, it's really not. This is one of those ones that's better than nothing, like WEP, but it's also easily bypassed. I can spin up a virtual machine on my computer in a matter of minutes. I can install a virtual NIC card in my virtual machine I just created, and then I can put in whatever MAC address I want. So if I know a MAC address of any device on your network, then I can spoof that address on my computer and bypass MAC filtering. So, but for the purposes of the A+, they consider this a security measure, but it only works if you only have a few devices on your network. This would not work if you had 1,000 devices. Who wants to sit there and put in 1,000 MAC addresses, right? But if you had like 10 to 20 devices, this would work. You could set it up. So that is MAC filtering. All right. Wi-Fi protected protected setup. I truly, truly hate this. This is where you go in and you press that little button on the top of your printer or the top of your internet or your router or any of that stuff. And then it just pops into your phone and then you're able to hook up and it's so easy, right? This is like the largest security breach in most networks. And here's the fun thing. It's thoroughly a cracked protocol, and the person who's cracking it doesn't even need to be standing next to the router to initiate it. This leaves your network wide open. So go into your router, turn it off. If you have a printer with it on there, turn it off. This allows people access to your networks. So this is essentially was just set up so that people could just press a button and log into a network rather than having to put in a complicated SSID or password, all that kind of fun stuff. But it just opened up a back door. All right. Questions on WPS? Other than it's bad. All right. Next, DNZ, or demilitarized zone. This is typically used in enterprise settings. And what it's doing is it's creating an area in your network that has access to the outside world that can be protected from information on the inside of your network. So if we have customers that are not a part of our company, what are some things we would want them to get a hold of? Like, what would be some things that they would need to connect to our network with? Any guesses? If I sell t-shirts, how would they connect with me?
Using a website?
Web server, right? So, web server. If I had salespeople, what would be something that they may need to connect with on our servers if they're not on site at the company? Am I going to send them a message via Telegram? Virtual desktop could possibly be one. Files, maybe. More basic.
Hotspot.
What was that, Sabby?
Hotspot.
Hotspot? Well, they would hopefully have that with them. But email, right? There we go. So email. So we would have a basic firewall here, you know, but it would allow people to come through and visit our web server. You know, sales professionals come in and check their emails, you know, maybe a few things. But this would be stuff that would be accessible from outside of the company network. Then we would create another firewall with a lot more security. And what do we think we would want to keep behind this? So we have, you know, web servers and emails and all that stuff. What are some things we would not want anybody on the outside to see?
File server?
Files, okay. Say file servers, that might be one. What else? User info, okay. Accounting information, how much money we have, who owes us money, who we owe money to, where do we keep our money? Anything else? Sensitive information like research and development. HR information like all the personally identifiable information of all of our employees. Social security numbers, medical records, things like that. Cameras, like all of our security apparatuses. All that kind of fun stuff we would keep behind a secondary firewall, right? So we would have, my drawing just gets worse as we go. We would have a first firewall, which would be basic, that would have stuff that, you know, the public would have access to. So we would have web servers, email servers, and stuff like that. And then we would have the stuff that we would only want to be accessed internally, which would be research and development, accounting, personnel information, files, all that kind of fun stuff behind a much more robust firewall. So we've created kind of a two-layer security apparatus. This area between here is called the DMZ, or the demilitarized zone. It has a fancy new name. Give me 1 second. They still call it DMZ on the, yeah, there's another name for it. I'll find the new name for it that A+ uses. But serves the same purpose. It just has a new name.
The
Is this-
ingress, egress. Okay.
Egress, ingress, egress.
Is it-
No, that's the demarcation point.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. But does this make sense? So we have the outside internet, which is the Wild West, hackers galore. We create a basic layer of security, which keeps most of the riffraff out. And then we have our web servers and email come through. We have a much more robust firewall that has all of our really sensitive stuff. But this little middle ground area where we want like external customers to come in and look and all that fun stuff, you know, that is the DMZ. So when we Google something, what type of server, where do you think the server is located that we're Googling? Do we think it's back here? Or do we think it's up here?
Up top.
Up top in the DMZ, right? Hopefully. But yeah, typically when we're interacting with most companies, we are interacting with them at this level. We are not down here at this level. This makes sense. Okay. All right, some other features we may have, the DHCP or Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. This is where we would get our IP addresses handed out to us that we were going to utilize internally. And oh, by the way, on your router at your house, you could set the range and IP addresses that you want to use in your DHCP on your router. So if you want to start playing around with stuff like that, you can. We can set up network address translation, which is typically utilized because we're all going to be sharing the same external IP address. And so that NAT would function within the router. And then we have quality of service. Does anybody remember what we are talking about when we say quality of service with regards to internet?
Would it be like settings, kind of?
It would be a setting, but what kind of settings would you want to set up for quality of service?
Hmm.
Are all internet packages created equal?
No.
So what do we think we might do? Should email be treated the same way as your streaming?
No.
How so? Why?
Because streaming requires a lot more data than just sending an email.
That's part of it. Are you going to notice if you receive an email 30 seconds later?
No.
Are you going to notice if there's a 30-second delay in your streaming?
Yes.
So which of these would have priority?
Streaming.
Okay. So we can establish quality of service based on type of internet packets. Who gets priority for the bandwidth? Because remember, we only got so much bandwidth, right? So we only have so much we can deal with upstream and downstream. So we have to establish what's called quality of service. Different types of packets have different levels of priority. Email, it's kind of one of those like you can wait. Whenever there's a gap or an opening, then you can go through. Voice over IP, we're talking about digital phone calls, streaming, where we're going to have like Zoom meetings like we have right now. If there's delays, they're noticeable and can cause problems. So we want to make sure that information like this has the highest priority. And then there's several tiers that you can operate. And that's what we mean when we say quality of service on our network bandwidth. We can't control how much information we can send at one time, but we can control who has priority to move through that line. Right? All right. So, port filtering and port forwarding. Inside your router, one of you was asking like, how do we do this? But inside your router, you have the ability to turn off ports and turn on ports or open and close them either in blocks or individually to do what's called hardening your system. So you can do this on the router level and you can do this on the individual computer level. So if you have a computer or an area on your network set up as strictly as a web server, you don't necessarily need to have file transfer protocol or a bunch of others there set up because the interactions should almost strictly be with web servers, right? So this would be port filtering, us opening or closing specific ports. Maybe we only want secure traffic to pass through. So it has to have some level of encryption. So we would not open port 80 on our web server, which is a unsecure web protocol, we would use port 443, which is our HTTPS. So we would close 80, but open 443 to only allow secure communication. Right? So that's port forwarding. Excuse me, port filtering. Then we have something that's called port forwarding. So let's go back to our video camera conversation we were having. So say I have a video camera, a PTZ or pan tilt zoom camera in my house that I use to kind of monitor what's going on here. I have, you know, young dogs that love to chew on things, so I like to be able to yell at them if I'm away, if they're, you know, getting on the couches or chew on things they shouldn't chew on. But I don't want just anybody logging into my camera when they come into my network. The cameras, as they're set up from the manufacturer, interact on port 80, which is what?
Are you asking if it's like HTTP?
There you go. Yeah, HTTP. So it's a web protocol, right? So that's the port that the camera that I have now works on, right? And so, and let's say that, you know, I'm going to use a private address, but, you know, let's just say 192.168.118.49. So this is my IP address. And how I would typically interact with this camera is I would go into my web browser and I would type in 192.168.118.49:80. So that tells me which port I'm going to interact with when I come into this network. And typically that would grant me access to the camera, right? Problem is that's easy, and if people know I have a camera, then this would be really easy to figure out, right? So I can do something that's called port forwarding, where I can set on my router a predetermined port, or if I have multiple cameras, how would it know which camera I need to interact with, right? So I could set predetermined port numbers up. So I could say when I come into my network, instead of port 80, it's port 64.213. I could predetermine this port. When it hits my router, will get forwarded directly to this camera at port 80. So I can pre-establish, based upon what port I'm using at my gateway router, when I'm trying to interact from the outside, who it's going to send information to. Does this make sense? Now, the likelihood of somebody just picking out of thin air port number 64.213 to be able to communicate with my cameras on my internal network is pretty low, right? But then being able to guess port 80, which is your generic web server portal, is pretty high, right? So this allows us to create a little bit more of a layer of security through obscurity. And I could have 64.213, 64.214, 64.215, 64.216, all going to different cameras. And then I would be able to pan through my various cameras on my web server and look and see what's going on in my security. I can also set this up for my printer at my house. If I want to print a document at my house and have it ready for when I get home, I can do the same thing. If I have a 3D printer and I know it takes a day or two to print something, I can send something to my 3D printer, like if I finish something up at the office, and have it working while I'm still at work, and then it'd be ready, I guess, when I come home or back from a trip or what have you. I could have it set up to my NAS, or my network attached storage, so I can watch movies when I'm on a trip or what have you. Port forwarding has multiple functions. And then there's a subset of this called port triggering, which is it's waiting for an internal event to trigger another port to open. And where this is most useful is in the FTP protocol. What are our port numbers for FTP?
21, 22.
20, 21.
20 and 21, right?
Mm.
Very close. So 20 and 21. And typically what this is outbound and inbound traffic. So if I send information out on FTP, it's going to go out on 20. When it comes back, it's going to come back on 21. This causes a problem with the firewall, doesn't it? Because if I go out on one port and try to come back on another, the firewall is typically going to stop it. So you have to set up what's called port triggering. So what will happen is when I send something out on port 20, it's going to let the firewall know to expect something back on port 21. But it's the sending of the initial information that triggers the firewall to open up the other port. So there's an event causing the firewall to react and open up another port. So it wouldn't be open all the time. It would only be open once this event occurs. Does this make sense from a theoretical level?
Yeah, does that second port stay open until something is received, or?
It may stay open for a predetermined amount of time. So if nothing comes back like within the next, minute or two, it'll just close up.
Okay.
Good question. Any other questions? So that's port filtering, where we would kind of harden our systems by determining what ports should be open, what ports should be closed. Port forwarding, where something would come in on a port and then be forwarded to another system on a specific port. And then port triggering, where an event that is happening inside would trigger the firewall to open up another. All this can be set up on your routers.
For port forwarding,
Mm-hmm.
can you use any port number that isn't temporary, or could you use those two?
I would avoid using the well-known ports,
Okay.
but like big companies will use well-known ports like the port 80 or port 443 a lot with port forwarding because they do something that's called server balancing. Do you think there was a server out there that could handle all of the Google requests just for the United States?
No.
But all those are going to go in on port 80, right? Or 443. So they'll have a port forwarding system set up with something that's called load balancing. And what it is there's, in Google's case, there is a warehouse of servers that just handle the front-facing single website Google at port 80. And so what happens is something comes in, you have a load balancer that'll go, okay, you go to server 1. Next person comes in, you go to server 2. Next person comes in, you go to server 3, server 4. And they have what's called a round robin. There's a couple different ways you can do it. One's called round robin, where you start at 1 and you work all the way around all the servers, and then you go back to 1. There's some that's based on traffic volume, because some inquiries are quick, some inquiries are a lot longer. So there's different ways that you can handle it. But yeah, you can use common ports, but typically from a small office, home office standpoint, we would use what's called the ephemeral ports, which are the really high numbered ones.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Hopefully I didn't make that worse.
Nope.
All right. VPNs we've talked about a couple times.
I have just a question, like
Yeah. Go ahead,
what
Majid.
if suppose like two different people have the same port settings? So what will happen in that situation?
What, two people with the same port settings
Yeah, by chance, like
on the same network?
no different network. not on the same network.
That happens all the time.
Oh, so it will
They're going to
not
be on different IP addresses, so the port settings are irrelevant, right? They're not going to interact with each other.
Oh, okay. So
Because you have to put in the
okay.
IP address
So-
first and then the port number.
Yeah, oh, okay. So if they were on the same network, then it will be a problem, right?
Yes, it could be, but that typically doesn't happen. But that would be up to the IT administrator to go fix it. Because typically what's happening, how the NAT works, like the network address translation, how the router knows who to communicate with is based on the port number. So if I'm sending a package to Google on port 80, the from port number would probably be something like 32,516. And then if you were in the same office as me, you sent one, yours might be 41,625. And then when it gets to Google, when the network address translation does, they drop your IP, but keep your port numbers. And then they put theirs there. So it goes off, hits Google at port 80. When Google responds, they respond to my port number. And when it comes back in, and that port number is on there, it says, okay, I know that port is associated with Kelly's computer. And so it forwards that packet to my computer. That's how the router is able to route the traffic when it comes back in on the NAT. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
It's the other piece of the
Kelly.
puzzle that we hadn't quite talked about yet.
Oh, thank you.
Mhm.
Kelly, those high port numbers, those are the, I forgot the name of it.
Ephemeral
superior-
ports.
Ephemeral, that's what you call it, yeah. Those ephemerals, they're used for anybody, right?
Yeah, they're basically, they don't have any predetermined purpose yet. And so they're used for general communication. So I think in philosophy, they talk about the ephemeral and the ineffable. One is like something that's hard and concrete, and you're able to actually know what it does. And then you have the ephemeral, which is kind of like out there in the ether. It's not really easily defined. It can serve multiple purposes and stuff like that. And I think that's kind of where it comes from. All right. Any other questions? All right. So VPNs we talked about a couple times before. This connection it's kind of a virtual connection. It kind of makes you virtually appear as if you're inside the network. So internal network sources will view you as if you're a local host and allow you access as such, where if it didn't view you that way, you wouldn't be able to get past the DMZ internally to view the the files or the accounting or R&D or all that kind of fun stuff. So your company may have a VPN server in order to establish this so that people can work remotely if they need to. This sets up a encrypted tunnel so that the information being transmitted out over the internet is not easily visible by other people. The encryption levels on this tend to be pretty good, especially in the enterprise level. And it also allows for what we call for unlocking regionally locked content. So in the same manner that it can make me appear as if I'm in the office, it can also make me appear as if I'm in New York, if I'm in California, if I'm in Canada, if I'm in Japan, if I'm in Germany or Egypt or Brazil or what have you. So I can appear as as if I am located in one of these places, even though I have not moved. All right. What do I do if I have problems with my router? As always, refer to the documentation. Make sure your SSID and password are correct and or not easily detectable, so people who are not supposed to be in the network don't just guess and get in. You know, if my password is like, or my SSID is Star Wars, and then I make my password like Luke Skywalker, it wouldn't take people very long to figure out, you know, what that password is because of the close association of those two terms. All right. If we're having issues with the router itself, like we're not able to get to the internet, first we try to hit our NIC. You know, how do I check and see if my NIC's working? What's 2 ways I can do this? There's a hardware and a software way to do it. Loopback. So I have loopback plug. There you go. What's the other thing I can do? All right, 127.0.0.1. So ping a loopback address. So that's the physical way, the hardware way, and the software way to do the same thing. Next, I would try to ping a local host. Like if Jamal and I were in the same office, I would get his IP and try to ping his computer and see if I could hit his computer. If I can't hit his computer, something, you know, that leads me in one direction. You know, maybe my NIC isn't working. Or maybe the router is completely down. But if I can ping Jamal's computer, but I can't ping Google's, something else is going on. I would go check my IP. Maybe I have a PIPA address. How do we recognize a PIPA address?
With the number starting at 127.
No, that's a loopback.
Sorry, 129, 169.
169 dot 254. 169.254. So if we see that, and we know we have a PIP address, and that means our DHCP server is not working right. So it may needs to be, you know, power cycled or something like that to get it up and running. Other thing, check our cables. Make sure things are plugged in if we use a wired connection. And remember, cables have two sides. So you don't just check it at the computer, you check it at the wall, especially in enterprise settings. Cleaning crews are busy. Great people, they got a lot of work to do. They have tendency to bump things. It happens. So a cable gets bumped repeatedly, it may come out of the wall. It may come out of the back of the computer. Not completely, but enough to where the connection is not able to be made. Next, you can go into your command line, do your IP config /all, verify all your settings. And then make sure that you're on, if you're supposed to be on a dynamic IP, make sure you are, because sometimes if you go to a PIPA, it sets as manual. Go back, set it back to dynamic. Or you can set it to static, manually enter in an IP if it's in the range to see if you can get on and communicate. But we'll get practice with these in labs too. All right. We just talked about a lot of these. PIP address. One thing to do also, go in your device manager, make sure it recognizes your network adapter without any errors. Could be the drivers. If you're receiving errors, you go ahead and you can update your drivers. If you just downloaded an update and it doesn't work, you can roll it back to a previous one. There could be address conflicts, like you have an appropriate address, but there could be somebody else on the network with the exact same address, and two with the same address cannot talk at the same time. So theirs it may have been set statically, where yours is dynamically, in which case you would need to go into the command line, type in ipconfig /release, and then type in ipconfig /renew to give up your old IP and to request a new one. And that should clear up that issue for you. This also works for limited connectivity as well. That's typically the limited or intermittent means there's somebody else on the line with a similar IP. Here are the examples. Questions on this? Don't worry, you'll get a chance to practice it. Wi-Fi common wireless issues. People go on trips, they turn on airplane mode, forget to turn it off. Happens. So double check, make sure it's turned on. Also, it could be a place where they're too far from the antenna, or the antenna is in a bad location. One example they give of this is like, say you're in an office and the centrally located on the floor where you work, the break room is in the middle. And so you have a client calling in around lunchtime, says every day, same time, I lose connectivity. And what's probably happening is lunchtime. What gets used a lot during lunchtime?
Microwave.
Microwave. There you go. So you're on the opposite side of the office than the Wi-Fi antenna. People are turning on the microwave repeatedly, and it's killing your internet connection. Case like this, likely the person either would need to relocate their desk, or another wireless access point would need to be established on the other side of the break room to prevent the interference of the microwave during lunch, or tell people they can only eat cold food. Usually doesn't go well. The other one is entering the wrong passphrase or SSID, trying to connect to the wrong network. If you're in the office, you're trying to connect to the guest network rather than the actual office network, cause issues there. And then they're too far from the antenna themselves, and the signal's too weak, so they have an intermittent connection, so they may need to move closer. And here's another version of the previous slide we used with the 802.11 wireless standards. A good one to take a picture of. And it kind of sums it up. Again, you don't need to worry about the range. That's Network Plus, and you don't need to worry about the year it was adopted. But if you see what I was talking about earlier, where A and B were adopted at the same time, both were put in 1999. Questions? All right. We should now be able to compare and contrast internet connection types and features: POTS, ISDN, DSL, fiber optic, satellite, cellular, all that kind of fun stuff. Compare and contrast some of the Wi-Fi networking standards and encryption types: WEP, WPA, WPA2, WPA3. Talked about the role of the router. And we talked a little bit about some problems you might experience and how we might set those up. What's our homework for tonight?
Log into our router.
And do what?
Change username and password.
Change username and password.
Change the username and password. All right, and I'll drop links in chat in the class channel on Slack to let you kind of know what your username and password is if you're not aware. The other thing you can do is quite literally Google your ISP, like, you know, I have a Comcast router or an Xfinity router or a Verizon router or a AT&T router. What's my sign-in and password? And it'll just tell you. So that's your homework for tonight. Let's just start turning stuff off. There you go. That works too.
And DMZ is now known as Screen Subnet.
Screen subnet. Thank you.
Mhm.
DMZ is so much easier to remember.